ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Sorry for the delay. Because the Friday afternoon is very busy right now. I would like to welcome you at our university and I don't have to present you one of our lecturers, Professor Stephen Baskerville. I'm very happy that Professor Baskerville is our guest at our faculty, at our university. And I'm very happy that there will be the next one of the next lecture conducted by Professor Baskerville, the open lecture. The title of lecture is Why America Become Woke, because you explained to me that this is something different. Like in the Polish title, it's communist. But in fact, you would like to speak about the woke, right? So yeah, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lewandowski, for that introduction. And yes, that is one of the things I'll talk about. So you can take the title of communist, or you can take the title of woke, but I'll explain the difference in a few minutes. Let's see. I want to talk today about the events, sorry, I'm going to try and, there we go. I want to talk today about the events of the last 3 years and explain why they happened. And this is the gist of a book that I'm preparing on the topic of the events of the last 3 years. And my main focus will be on the United States, because that's the epicenter of the events. But I also will draw a few lessons tonight specifically for East Central Europe. I should start by saying that I never preached the converted. I'm not here, sorry, what happened here? This is why I wanted a printed version. Did I get a printed version? There we go. Yeah. I never preached to the converted. I'm not here to tell you things that you already know. I won't describe the events of the last 3 years, and I'm not going to engage in any polemic or launch any invective against the leftist administration, which now controls the US government, or give my opinion about why its policies are foolish and destructive. There are many accounts that do this already, and you don't need another one. Instead, I want to explain why it happened. Why did a junta of amateurish, semi-adolescent ideologues overcome all opposition and seize control of the greatest democracy, greatest power in history? How did they position themselves to inflict reckless and destructive policies governing the most serious matters like public health, constitutional freedoms, and world peace? Policies that some people consider crimes because of the deadliness of their consequences. And why did they command almost uniform obedience, not only in the United States, but throughout the advanced Western democracies? And further, why are they able to continue doing it? Okay. Plenty of accounts tell us what happened. None seem very interested in telling us why. And this in itself is revealing. The indifference to this question, I think, may partly provide the answer. Today, one huge and undeniable fact now hangs over the conservative world, and it mustn't be neglected. The political opposition in the United States has failed terribly. It was a Maginot Line that has simply collapsed. The left staged a coup d'etat, and for now it reigns triumphant. One commentator writes, quote, "The past 3 years have been the most successful exercise of power on a global scale ever seen, if by successful we mean dramatically intensifying the control of the ruling class over the whole population in the shortest possible amount of time," end quote. Well, we cannot afford to allow this triumph to take place here as well in East Central Europe. It's long been an axiom in Europe that what happens in America will eventually happen here. So the events in the United States therefore stand as a warning to us. And I also want to make it clear that I will be blunt about this. I don't think any constructive purpose is served by criticizing the radical left for its success, even though that is what most conservative commentators do. Some constructive good might come of criticizing the rest of us for our failure. And this is precisely what is not done. Anyone who's afraid to ask themselves why they failed is at best stagnant and shallow and perhaps frightened of what they might find. At worst, they might be covering up their own ineptitude or perfidy. Okay? Religious people have a principle. When confronting any external adversity, we must first examine the sin within. Okay? How are we responsible for this? What have I done or not done to bring this about? I think it's more constructive to identify some of the things that the rest of us did or did not do that allowed the left to take power. There are some obvious, but I think inadequate explanations already. The 2020 election was stolen by a combination of ballot rigging, social media censorship, and intrigue by the security and intelligence agencies, say some people. Others emphasize the machinations of global elites, wealthy and powerful people who desire more wealth and power over us. Still others explain it all in terms of mass psychosis. We are all mentally defective. Okay? Well, all of these may be true, they don't fully explain it. Okay? Whether the left's methods were fair or unfair, above board or surreptitious, legitimate or dirty, the fact remains we allowed them to take control. Why? Okay? One might even argue, after all, that the left did what they always do, and it was the other side that ran away from the fight. I don't think this is completely true. The left did undertake some decisive political innovations, but even then, it was the rest of us that failed to understand their importance, and we were blindsided as a result. And in our ignorance, some of us even unwittingly abetted their rise to power. Well, I have followed others in describing the new left junta as communist, and while it does bear some resemblances, it is not really communist at all. It marks the triumph of the new left. The new left is a homegrown American style of radicalism with a politics that prioritizes race, environmentalism, and most enigmatic of all, sex. In fact, I believe that one major reason for the defeat is that many people deceive themselves with their single-minded and misdirected crusade against communism, or more vaguely, against cultural Marxism. Like the proverbial generals, conservative political operators stubbornly insist on fighting the previous war rather than the one that confronts us now. Having won that war against communism makes them feel in control of this one. But more seriously, by resurrecting and verbally flogging the defeated enemies of yesteryear, I think they hope to avoid confronting the potent enemies who are attacking us right now. And most debilitating of all, I think some also fear to offend powerful people in their own ranks, who very much need to be offended if any effective response is to be developed. I think the fear of offending people is one of the biggest problems. Unlike the old left and the reconstructed Marxism that focused on class conflict, the woke left today combines different issues that are thrown together into a grab bag of grievances. Class, race, gender is the standard trilogy, plus the environment and a few other things. I think we have to acknowledge, as many on the right are not willing to do, that the issues raised by the left are in fact important. But they are not important in the way the left says they are. They are not all the same, and they must not be taken as the left presents them as some kind of seamless web of equivalent injustices. Class, race, and gender, and other things, are all important, but for different reasons, and they must be disentangled and addressed in order to grasp what's really going on. And that's part of what I want to do tonight. Tonight, I've identified several factors that I believe have contributed directly to this coup d'etat. There are things that have not been discussed by others recently or in this context, and that, I think, is the problem. They involve thinking outside the box. All of them require that we go back a few years, back to the radicalism of the 1960s or even earlier, to re-examine some of the things that we either accepted or neglected too quickly, without thinking too much about them, but things that have now come back to haunt us. Okay? There are things that cannot be blamed entirely on the radical left, nor on the perfidious right, or on anyone else. Okay? There are things we have to accept responsibility for them ourselves. I cannot discuss them all today, but I've chosen a few that I think are directly relevant to those of us in this room. The first is the prerequisite for all the rest, and it involves the creation of what is sometimes called the political class. Now, I want to make it clear that what I'm criticizing here are trends and not people. Okay, the trends are not necessarily bad in themselves, and they may be unavoidable, but if we are not careful, they can have unintended consequences. I'm not suggesting that we should abolish the political class, even were that possible, which it's not. Okay, in fact, it is a fact, and in fact, we are all part of it. Okay, most of us here in this room are members, perhaps not of the Washington political class, but of its equivalent. And I mean professors, educators, advocates and lawyers, even students. Okay? So we need to be aware of the dangers and try to mitigate the consequences, or we can be defeated the way the Americans were defeated. So please accept what I'm saying tonight as an exercise in self-criticism and a warning to all of us that what has befallen us in America should not be allowed to happen here. The first stage in the coup d'etat goes back some years ago, when under the power of radical ideology, Americans lost their citizenship to a new kind of professional politics. This involved transferring control over civic life from unpaid citizens to paid professionals. Like most political innovations, this one came from the left, but it also had an effect on the right. It opened the door to a vital principle of what I call the iron law of Washington. The iron law of Washington is this: people who are paid to solve problems have a vested interest in perpetuating the problems they are paid to solve. Okay? There's no avoiding this law. It's inevitable. It holds true for elected officials, career civil servants, lobbyists and lawyers, foundations, scholars and think tanks and universities, journalists and pundits. And it is also what many of the most intelligent and politically engaged students aspire to become. Okay? Conservative Republicans in America complain the most about this problem, and that they identify it with government bureaucrats. But the dirty secret is that they themselves are equally part of it. Okay? And the consequences are more serious, given that they are the ones who are supposedly opposing it. If they are paid to oppose it, then they too are in its grip. Regardless of ideology, once your livelihood depends on the existence of a problem, you will do anything to make sure that problem never goes away. And you may well look for opportunities to make it worse. Okay? Once this rule is understood, everything about our current crisis falls into place. We are now experiencing the culmination of a long tragedy of Americans delegating and abdicating their civic responsibilities to a professional political class whose open-ended power derives from prolonging and neglecting and even sabotaging their own work and doing the opposite of what they seem. The left wing of that class is now imposing its will on the world, and the right wing is pretending to oppose it. Okay? For all the talk of public interest, this development doesn't really empower the citizenry or enable their voices to be heard. On the contrary, it was the citizens that were eclipsed and displaced by the professionals. Okay? And vividly illustrating this principle is that it is equally true of the organizations that did traditionally provide moral leadership and a voice for American citizens. Perhaps the most striking feature of America's professional political groups is what they are not. They are not the civic institutions that Americans traditionally relied on to voice opposition to the abuse of government power. They are not churches. In fact, churches are precisely what they have displaced and replaced. Here's where the iron law demonstrates both its subtleties and its enormous consequences. American conservatives complain interminably that the left seeks to, quote, banish religion from the public square. Okay? But it is the professionalization of conservatism that has done the most to displace churches from their traditional civic role. Their professional political organizations, whether ostensibly Christian or not, are what have driven churches from active public engagement or allowed them to run away. Okay? In the United States, all the major Protestant denominations are largely captured by the left. But the silence of even individual churches and individual churchmen as voices of dissent is perhaps the single most debilitating development in American civic life today. I heard an example today on the radio I'll tell you about if you like. I mean, it's an important development. You could write a whole book about it. This is not to say that clergymen should be political activists and seek to transform society ideologically. That's what they are on the left, but I'm not advocating this on the right. Quite the opposite. But it is still true that the defining moments of Western history have been marked by dissident churchmen who have stood up in the face of egregious tyranny, pointed their fingers at the civil rulers, and said in no uncertain terms that they were abusing their power and violating the laws of God. And I'm thinking here of men like Ambrose of Milan, Thomas Becket, Stanislaus of Szczepanów, John Fisher, Joseph Vincenti, Richard Wurmbrand, Martin Luther King, John Paul II. Okay? No such churchmen have arisen in the United States today. Similar, okay? Similar men, even in the realms that constitute the church's core mission and that matter most for our civilization. Okay? As voices of opposition, they've been eclipsed by the professionals. This has had severe consequences, especially in the critical areas of government policy that at one time were universally recognized as firmly within the legitimate purview of the churches. Okay? And these have been decisive in allowing the left to take power. I'm thinking particularly, most obviously, of marriage and sexual morality. Okay? Nobody denies that marriage and sexual morality are legitimate areas of the church to be concerned about. And those are subjects which are also having a huge impact today on government policy and social policy. Okay, so the churches could be involved in these things without, you know, breaching church and state, without stepping on the toes of the civil authorities, is my point. Even those areas which are basic to the church's calling, mission, they're silent for the most part. At least in the United States they are. Okay, and I should say here that my talks, my remarks here, do pertain to an American context, and perhaps largely a Protestant, or at least a pluralist one. Okay, I realize here in Poland, I'm not suggesting that, you know, Ordo Iuris or Collegium Intermarium is likely to displace the Catholic Church as a voice for public morality, and perhaps that's important. You know, perhaps it's the strong role of the Catholic Church in Poland that makes Poland unique in the European Union, and that prevents this kind of trend from happening here. But still, the things that I'm noting about the United States are things that are happening in Europe also. And I think they're things that we have to, you know, we have to keep an eye out, even if they don't seem likely in Poland right away. Okay? Having displaced the citizenry and the churches as voices of opposition, there can be no doubt that professional conservatives in the United States have failed to oppose the left. Since well before the 2020 election, sympathetic critics have been stymied by what they call the do-nothing leadership of the Republicans in particular, and of conservative groups in general. Okay? That they refused to examine their own repeated failures, that they stubbornly adhered to cliched dogmas, that they obsessed with building personal fiefdoms and empires, and that they even silenced dissent, much like we criticize the left for cancel culture. Okay? So, I think that in many ways, American Republicans and conservatives have been stuck in the battles of yesteryear. They've seriously misunderstood the dynamics driving today's left, and they've contributed to its hegemony, to the point where they even aided its ascension to power. And I'll give you an example of that now, one of the most important, I think. But it's only one, but I think it's the most important one. And this involves the origins of what we call nowadays the deep state. The next stage in the left's coup d'etat was the creation of what we call the deep state, okay? The rule of the functionaries who populate permanent Washington, okay? This too is a creation of the left, but it also involved collusion from the right, okay? When we're seeking the origins of the deep state, most of us think about, you know, looking at the obvious centers of unaccountable power and misused power, okay? The clandestine operations of rogue security services, the public health authorities that seem, you know, determined to destroy the public health, or global plutocrats seeking to re-engineer or reset the world. Okay. But these are not where it began. and they could not exist without others having invented the model. Again, some things that we all accepted and neglected for too long and thought we could ignore are now resurfacing to create a tyranny around us. If the deep state is defined as powerful people using functionaries to control the private lives of millions of people, then the deep state originated in how America addressed the basic problem of modern society, which is the problem of the poor. We solved the problem of poverty in America by erecting a massive semi-socialist governmental leviathan to take control over and administer the lives of the poor, in effect to keep them out of our sight while flattering our self-image as doers of good. As it turned out, the leviathan perpetuated and proliferated their poverty, and now the monster and its offspring have turned its sights on us. Okay. The greatest illustration of the iron law, the most massive and the one that has festered the longest and furnished the model for all the rest, in fact, the one that provides many weapons for the left's coup d'etat, is the gargantuan welfare state. This quasi-socialist behemoth creates and perpetuates poverty and connected social ills, so that armies of civil servants can pretend to combat them. At one time, it was an object of suspicion by both the left and the right. Yet today, it is now so massive and powerful that neither one dares to confront it. And it is devouring American society financially, socially, politically, and morally, as the events of the last 3 years demonstrate very clearly. And here I'm speaking specifically of the American welfare state, not the European, and I'll explain about that in just a moment. The welfare state in America is the foundation of socialist government. It represents the most radical innovation in the basic role of the state in all of modern history. When it comes to cadres of impartial and high-minded civil servants forcibly controlling and manipulating the private lives of millions of non-criminal citizens, the welfare state is the original deep state. The welfare juggernaut involves much more than wasteful programs serving lazy spongers, as we say, as some conservatives insist. It also furnishes invaluable tools and weapons to the radical left and the political class generally that they use to stage their coup. Okay? The train of events culminating in that coup was set in motion by the death of George Floyd in a Minneapolis ghetto in May of 2020, and the riots that ensued in the name of racial or social justice. In other words, it all started with a milieu of dysfunctional and violent welfare communities, which I'm sure you've all seen on television. The welfare leviathan has long been criticized by conservatives using stock cliches. It is bloated, expensive, wasteful, inefficient, full of lazy cheaters, but the cliches don't begin to explain it, don't begin to describe it. In fact, these platitudes miss the point, because the huge expenditures are actually quite minor compared to the far greater costs produced by its social and political destructiveness. Excuse me. Welfare is government's self-expanding engine for creating social problems for itself to solve. The effects are more than wasteful, for the money is spent to turn children into dropouts, delinquents, criminals, addicts, derelicts, prostitutes, and rioters. Okay? Precisely the problems that then rationalize more government programs, more government spending, more government power. Gargantuan welfare expenditures are less important than the vast bureaucratic industries that are created to deal with the social fallout, with the social problems that come out of it. Okay? And these things are like law enforcement and incarceration, education, housing, health, and social services. Okay? These things are far more expensive than the welfare expenditures themselves. So it creates problems that costs more money. Okay? An exploding American budget is devoted almost entirely, the domestic American budget, is devoted almost entirely to social pathologies created and bred by welfare. Okay? Americans took a unique road to socialism. Unlike Europeans, they created a government engine for breeding its own class of insurgents. They knew that doctrinaire socialism and Marxism held little appeal for Americans, so the left did an end run. They enlisted Americans to socialism by forsaking class warfare and instead launching an appeal in the name of families and children, which even conservatives could not resist. The hardline purists, the hardline left, rejected welfarism as a capitalist scheme to co-opt the working class. But the soft left, the established left, erected a different kind of welfare, not broad-based social insurance for everyone, as you have in Europe, but instead a safety net limited to the poor that was anything but safe. Okay? This operated according to its own innovative dynamic, and it literally bred its own quasi-proletariat of the marginalized, resentful, and entitled, all managed and directed by a vanguard of radicalized apparatchiks. Okay? The growth of welfare throughout the 20th century under progressivism, the New Deal, and especially the Great Society programs with its war on poverty of the 1960s, all of this accomplished what slavery and segregation could not do. It decimated the African American family and created a permanent, self-perpetuating underclass of impoverished single mothers, fatherless children, and criminalized fathers. Now, given the irrefutable fact that every major social pathology is directly attributable to this demographic, fatherless children, not to race and not to class, it's hardly surprising that the result was a self-destructive horde of criminals, delinquents, truants, addicts, and derelicts that proceeded to tear down their own communities and quickly populated the world's most massive prison system. Okay? At the same time, it created armies of civil servants to administer and institutionalize their lives, both in and out of detention. Okay? These civil servants had a self-interest in perpetuating and expanding the havoc. It also bred an angry subculture of victimization, entitlement, and resentment. Having said all that, though, I also want to just mention, in my opinion, the horrible truth of it all is that while the rage of the underclass is misdirected, I do not think it's entirely unjustified. Okay? The population of the underclass was overwhelmingly minority, and so everyone else got in the habit of not caring. And this is the ironic grain of truth in the otherwise diversionary accusation of racism. Okay? The left feigned compassion for oppressed blacks. But the left couldn't decide if the cause of their oppression was racism or capitalism. Of course, it was neither. Okay? Conservatives could have taken the moral high ground and reaped decisive political advantage by pointing out that the real culprit was family destruction. And they could have acted on that insight. Instead, they decided that the only solution was law and order, with ever harsher punishments that further expanded the gulag, the prison system, and also expanded the resentment. Okay? So the right, the conservatives foolishly yielded the moral high ground to the left. And therefore they had no plausible remedy to offer other than what I think was an ugly punishment mentality when faced with periodic revolts following the murder of Martin Luther King, Rodney King's beating, and George Floyd's death, and many more. I mean, these things are still happening. Every time a black man dies at the hands of police, there's riots and violence and outrage. And it keeps happening year after year. And the left says it's racism, which is, I think, nonsense. But the right has no good answer. The right just says, no, it's not racism. It's not police brutality. It's not this, it's not that. The right never comes out and says what it is. Okay, so this is my complaint, I think, and this is a big part of the problem. I think all of this suggests the origins of our crisis and something that conservatives claim to understand and confront, but do not. And that is government's systematic destruction of families. More precisely, it demonstrates the full fallout of what one scholar calls, quote, the most harmful demographic trend of this generation. And that's, end quote, eliminating fathers from the lives of tens of millions of children. This long ago transformed low-income communities into war zones ruled by gangs, and it now wreaks havoc on middle-class society as well. It also furnishes the material for the adolescent revolts like the one sparked by George Floyd's death and organized by Black Lives Matter. Fatherlessness, not poverty and not race, already accounts for every social pathology among the young. This is well known. I'm going to go through this quickly. The violent criminality, substance abuse, and truancy that draw the police to the ungovernable minority and poor communities in the first place. Fatherless youth suffer disproportionately emotional disturbance and self-destructive disorders like depression and suicide. And precisely those, incidentally, I'll just add here, it's worth emphasizing, that precisely those disorders that psychologists now associate with the COVID lockdowns, okay? They indulge more in smoking, alcohol, obesity, and other unhealthy practices. They account for most mass shooters and even terrorists, at least in Europe. They then perpetuate the mayhem into the next generation by siring and bearing more out-of-wedlock children. Okay, so this perpetuates itself from one generation to the next, and just only gets worse year after year. In short, while some rise above their origins, fatherless youth are more likely to be dysfunctional and self-destructive, and, in ways that lack purpose and direction, rebellious. Adolescents rage out of control because they never had any parental authority, especially paternal authority, to keep them under control and teach them how to channel their discontents with the world's imperfections into constructive criticism and productive habits of life. Okay? Welfare's dynamic as a breeder of social anomie, social chaos, was recognized early on by serious social critics, and reform was among the Republicans' top domestic priorities until the 1990s. Okay? In 1968, the first Republican platform after Lyndon Johnson's Great Society denounced the practice of providing welfare benefits to unmarried mothers because, quote, it erodes self-respect and discourages family unity and responsibility. Okay? The devastation commanded serious attention from respected scholars and intellectuals, both conservative and liberal, who issued urgent calls for reform. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, famous political sociologist, later a US senator, famously prophesied in 1965, quote, a community that allows large numbers of young men to grow up in broken families, dominated by women, never acquiring any stable relationship to male authority, that community asks for and gets chaos. Okay? That chaos, multiplied many times over many decades since 1965, is what confronts us today. In those days, liberals and moderates like Moynihan were also concerned about trapping the poor in welfare dependency. And they saw government charity as second best to social reform. In fact, as I mentioned, even radical Marxists had long denounced welfarism as an insidious tool of capitalism because it placated the poor and the working class and dampened their revolutionary fervor. Right? In short, everyone from the left to the right, from the right to the far left, at least agreed that the poor should not remain poor, that welfare handouts were inherently demeaning, and that poor people, or all people, should eventually, by whatever means, lead lives of economic self-sufficiency. Okay? So from its inception, therefore, welfare involved pacts with the devil from everybody. Okay? A rough consensus of left and right regarded it as a temporary necessity that should be rendered unnecessary as soon as possible. So everyone agreed that welfare was bad. The conservatives, liberals, even radical Marxists were all against welfare. Everyone was working to ways to get rid of it. What happened? What happened to this consensus? Why did we not only not eliminate it, but we even stopped talking about eliminating it? It hasn't gotten any better. The problem hasn't been solved since the 1990s. It's just we stopped talking about it around the 1990s. Okay? Why? Well, while the right and the old left were debating poverty, a new ideology had arrived on the scene. It drew upon socialist narratives, but it also transformed them. The new ideologues were not really concerned about poverty at all, which is why we don't really hear much about poverty these days. Nobody really seems to care about it, even though it exists, of course. And the new ideologues also understood full well that minority impoverishment was not caused by racism or capitalism. Okay? They knew that the culprit was family destruction, because if they did not create it, they certainly exploited and exacerbated it. The new ideologues were devoted first and foremost to sexual liberation. Okay? It was the radical feminists who overturned the anti-welfare consensus by shifting the purpose from relieving poverty to promoting women's empowerment and sexual freedom. This transformed the welfare machinery from a necessary evil into a positive good. And it intentionally glorified and proliferated single parenthood that really proliferated and created the underclass in its destructiveness and its rage. Okay? If perpetuating poverty was the price of sexual freedom, they were perfectly willing, for others, to pay that price. And I've got a nice quote here from a group of socialist feminists, led by Barbara Ehrenreich, from a book she edited and from the introduction. Quote, independence, even in straitened and penurious form, okay, still offers more sexual freedom than affluence gained through marriage and dependence on one man. Okay? See what she's saying, what they're saying there? That, okay, if the price of sexual freedom is poverty, fine, we'll have poverty. Because the important thing is sexual freedom. If other people have to live in poverty because of that, so be it. We don't care. That's what the left was saying. Okay? And here the radicals were exploiting a basic fallacy and dynamic that had been driving poverty throughout the 20th century and was now becoming conspicuous. But liberal society stubbornly refused to face it. And that was this. In history's most affluent societies, the poor are not starving children with distended bellies. Okay? They are almost all the children of single parents. They are victims, in other words, not of a stingy or oppressive society, but of a sexually indulgent one. Okay? The welfare state could not remedy this. It could only make it worse, which is what it had already been doing inadvertently, but now it proceeded to make it worse on purpose. Okay? Exacerbating this dynamic was the fact that the welfare system, though quasi-socialist in its origins, was dominated from the start by radical feminists. Okay? Previous to this, private charity had been operated by churches, okay, and volunteer women, driven by a sense of Christian calling and supported financially by their husbands. Okay? These women did not merely provide material substance, but also inculcated and enforced Christian sexual morality that refused to condone single motherhood. Okay? The welfare system replaced these women with a new class of paid professional social workers, who, these social workers, consistent with the Iron Law, quickly developed a vested interest in perpetuating the poverty and connected problems that justified their existence. Okay? Single parenthood was their bread and butter and went from being an evil to an asset. Anti-male ideology, imparted by ideologues running from Jane Addams. Jane Addams was the founder of the American social work industry. And she was a radical feminist. Running from Jane Addams to later women's studies programs. So the radical anti-male ideology dovetailed with bureaucratic self-interest to make single parenthood the desired norm. And it ensured that the breadwinners, who alone could free the women and children from dependence on the state, stayed away. Okay? This is why for decades the man in the house rule never managed to get abolished. The man in the house rule was the rule that said that for a mother and child to receive welfare payments, there couldn't be a man in the house. The man had to leave, or he had to disappear. Okay? Everyone thought this was crazy, and it was crazy. But it continued year after year after year, because the welfare matriarchs didn't want men in the houses. That would make them redundant. Okay? So we replaced Christian women with paid who had an incentive to mitigate poverty and minimize poverty. We replaced them with paid professional social workers who had an incentive to proliferate poverty. And that's exactly what they did. Okay? So the welfare system was now empowering. Not so much for the single mothers who received it, but above all for the radical functionaries who dispensed it. And this became starkly evident. This became evident as the social workers acquired new police powers that originated to administer the chaos of single-parent communities and fatherless communities, and which they found far more empowering than just doling out money. Okay? These are things like child protection, domestic violence programs, and child support enforcement. These programs not only entrenched single parenthood, but they also elevated the social workers to the status of plainclothes leftist police. Most importantly, they displaced and replaced the fathers by usurping their roles as protectors and providers for the women and children. In fact, the fathers became the principal targets of the new police powers. Their status was transferred from being protectors of women and children to being batterers and pedophiles who abused them, and from being providers to being deadbeats who ran away. Okay? Now, most empowering of all, the social workers could remove them by force and incarcerate them without trial. So, further validating the iron law, the social work gendarmes thus showed themselves to be the creators of criminals in multiple senses. Okay? First, they turned the adolescents into criminals by removing the fathers and make sure they grow up without fathers. Secondly, they criminalized the fathers by accusing them of child abuse and domestic violence. And thirdly, or non-payment of child support. And thirdly, the third stage in the process, which is now in full swing, involves the criminalization of the police, right? Of the rivals to the social workers, which are the uniformed police, who are now facing prison sentences because they're trying to keep order in all this, right? The policeman in the George Floyd death has now been convicted of murder. 5 policemen in Memphis are now facing murder charges in the connection with the recent death there of, what's his name, Tyre Nichols. Okay, so everyone's being criminalized by this. The adolescents, the fathers, and even the policemen are all becoming are being turned into criminals. Okay, so welfare was no longer just a government dole, distributing largesse to a political client base. It now became a leftist gendarmerie, with the gendarmes largely unconstrained by the constitutional controls that we normally place on uniformed policemen. Okay? The victims were no longer gender-neutral poor or working class. The victims were now abused children and battered women. And the villains changed from being capitalists, plutocrats, and bloodthirsty militarists to working class fathers, pedophiles, batterers, and deadbeat dads. Okay? In each case, the new police powers also necessitated an accompanying hysteria, claiming imminent and catastrophic harm, and demanding draconian crackdowns from the penal machine. Child abuse, domestic violence, unpaid child support, and so forth. Prior to these alarms, no public outcry had demanded that the government take action. No public perception of a problem even existed until government officials began saying that it did. In each case, the initiative came from government officials. So, concrete evidence provided by respected journalists and scholars, proving that these hysterias involved serious miscarriages of justice that undermined the constitutional order, okay, was never refuted but simply ignored. Now, it's important to understand, all this had huge importance for our broader politics. These hysterias were so spectacularly successful that they soon inspired additional ones: rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment, stalking, bullying. Most recently, I've just read about needle spiking and more. Okay? Initially, the brunt of the domestic violence and child abuse accusations fell upon young black men. And in the case of child abuse, sometimes young black women also. And the men were already targets for trumped up criminal accusations, especially feminist-driven accusations of rape. And this, of course, furthered their degradation started by welfare and consigned them more firmly to the criminal class, whether or not they were really criminals. But once in place, these new police powers and these new methods of accusation quickly expanded their scope beyond young black men and provided political weapons that were marshaled against other people. Middle-class fathers in divorce cases, homeschoolers, heterosexual parents, religious believers, male university students, servicemen, military men, and others. Okay? This expanded still further when the Me Too operation began going after male politicians, like Judge Brett Kavanaugh, perhaps most famously, celebrities like Bill Cosby and the Prince of York, whistleblowers like Julian Assange, and others whom the larger state machinery had targeted for elimination because it didn't like their politics, okay? So these sexual accusations became a tool, a convenient instrument for eliminating anybody whose politics you don't like. More recently, it's been used against parents who raise objections in school board meetings to the sexualization of their children, okay? So these weapons, these tools of making sexual accusations against parents or policemen or whoever, my point is all of this began in the American welfare system. That's where it was bred, where it was created, and that's where, from there, it grew out. Okay? And more recently, interestingly enough, the most recent development of this is that these hysterias also resemble the current COVID hysteria and the destructive and authoritarian policies accompanying it, for which they served as the rehearsal. Okay? And for this, I won't go into this, but Janice Fiamingo, an excellent writer at the University of Toronto, University of Ottawa, has written about this a lot, and she's very good, so I refer you to her work. Okay, so now the same modus operandi is being used to target Americans who stand against the leftist coup. As we'll see in a moment if I have time. People like Donald Trump, his supporters, the defendants in the January 6th trials, and others that the current leftist regime has targeted for elimination. Okay? So the methods they're using to eliminate Trump and his supporters, the January 6th defendants, again, all of this started in the welfare system. Now, this is only one example, I'm running out of time already, of how the new sexual agenda shifts the old fault lines and alignments and disguises the reality from people who cling to old dogmas without bothering to find out the truth or think it all through. The left has always been skillful at creating the very problems about which it complains, with the result that it becomes what it claims to oppose. The first person to observe this that I know of was Milovan Djilas back in the 1950s, the Yugoslav dissident. And he said the following. He said, quote, everything happened differently in the USSR and communist countries from what the leaders anticipated. Okay? The communist revolution conducted in the name of doing away with classes has resulted in the most complete authority of any single new class. Okay? End quote. Today's new left illustrates a similar dynamic by exploiting racial problems to further a broad leftist agenda, and especially the sexual agenda that then exacerbates the blight on the black community. Okay? By blaming the ever-spiraling black degradation caused by family destruction, by blaming that on racism, black resentment is the gift that keeps on giving for the left, even when the left is causing the problems. Okay? Do you see what I'm getting at here? This is how Black Lives Matter and other leftists are able to create their own endless supply of grievances. Okay? Ostensibly about racial justice, BLM, in fact, was the brainchild of sexual radicals. And the people it empowers are not low-income blacks, okay, but affluent sexual militants. And you just look at some of their rhetoric, their slogans, quote, these are quotations, queer affirming, transgender affirming, free from sexism, misogyny, and environments in which men are centered. Quote, dismantle the patriarchal practice, disrupt the nuclear family structure, collectively care for children. Okay, end quote. This is the perfect agenda to further decimate the black family and low-income communities and emasculate and criminalize the ever-disposable black male, young black male, who's the pivot, and the young black male is the pivotal character in this drama. And unfortunately, I think many American conservatives seem to have nothing but disdain for young black males, and this is costly. Okay, all this illustrates something quite striking about the coup, that the cutting edge of today's left, and what is more than anything provided the dynamic that allowed it to triumph, is, I believe, sexual radicalism. This is not obvious, and we can see how it is skillfully disguised by leftist operators, and more importantly, it is willfully ignored by rightist ones. Okay? But the devastation that is wrought in the black and other minority communities is only a foretaste of what is now wreaking throughout the Western world. Oh dear, I'm out of time. But let me just finish up. I was going to say a few other things. Anyway, but meanwhile, the ghettos continued exploding, fatherless children, this dysfunctionality was spreading to the middle class because of divorce, which had the same effect as welfare. And now we've moved on to a more serious stage. Okay? We've moved on. The welfare brings not only the underclass of the destructive and the self-destructive, but also a radical class that is increasingly politically aware, politically mobilized. The welfare underclass supplied the raw material for the left's coup, the seething resentment and the violence of black youth, the white middle class emulators and enablers who are similarly nihilistic despite their privilege, and the manipulation and exploitation of black poverty by sexual radicals. It's from this cauldron that the next stage emerges. The semi-educated intellectualize their rebelliousness using political ideologies and that collectivize their fury. Okay? As the children of welfare grow up, they're joined by better educated counterparts from middle class divorce, and they become something more than just criminals, addicts, derelicts, prostitutes, and shooters. They start to acquire political consciousness and organization. Okay? And the destructive rage of the ghetto becomes a revolt against America. This, I believe, is the hidden history of Black Lives Matter and Antifa. In short, social enemy has mutated into systematic revolt, and the state has acquired the mechanisms, the legal and bureaucratic mechanisms, to encourage this further. Okay, with fathers and men correspondingly emasculated, no effective resistance impedes the new Pinocchio utopia. Okay? I was going to talk about a few other things that I think also contributed to it, but I don't want to take any, we're out of time. I was going to talk about the judiciary in America, which is closely connected to this, and also the deterioration of higher education, which I'm going to talk about in my book, hopefully, if it comes out. So those are interesting subjects we might want to discuss in the questions, but I've run out of time. So I won't say anything more, except that, again, to reiterate that, you know, this is a warning. Again, I've concentrated on Washington, but during communism, a theme of East European dissidents was that communism serves as a kind of warning to the West, in the words of Václav Havel, revealing to it its own latent tendencies. Today, I think the Washington coup should be taken as a warning to the East and the rest of the world. East Central Europe is the greatest bastion of traditional values against leftist hegemony. I'm reminded of the famous dictum of the British geographer Halford Mackinder, who wrote, quote, "He who controls Eastern Europe controls the world." Mackinder assumed this control would be strategic and military, but his principle has equal validity with cultural and ideological control. East Central Europe offers hope to all of us in a kind of role reversal. I feel like an exile from the West, not unlike East Europeans who took refuge in the West during communism. And today it is not only the Western conservatives that should be offering lessons to Eastern Europe, but the other way around. Okay? So those of us in the political class, all of us here basically in this room, have a special responsibility as we do evil, as we battle against evil, not to become infected with the evil against which we do battle. It's an old problem in human history. I think we have to follow the medical principle that many health professionals these days seem to have forgotten, and that is, first, do no harm. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
And now we have a little break, and we will start another speech of Professor Dragan Dakic. Thank you very much. Thank you.